The North Colchester Cenotaph is also located on the front lawn. The Sharon United Church has recently received a designation as a heritage site.
Barring no more member statements, the House will recess for a few seconds while we await question period at 10. Order, please. We'll now begin with oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Yesterday, the integrity of the Premier's office itself was called into question, Mr. Speaker, and we now know the RCMP are investigating a very serious matter related to an audio recording of a conversation, including the Premier's Chief of Staff. I'd like to ask the Premier, why did he call in the RCMP?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know where the Honourable Member is getting his information. What had happened, there was a letter provided to this House that actually mentioned the RCMP, which had an audio associated with it. We felt compelled to those people that were mentioning it to hand it over to them. What they do with it, Mr. Speaker, is totally their responsibility and up to them. And I somehow, in this idea that the Leader of the Conservative Party is overstepping his assumption, quite frankly, in what the RCMP may do. They are an independent body who will act on the rule of law in this province, and they will make sure that every rule is followed in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the RCMP has confirmed they're investigating the audio recording that the Premier's office turned over to them. You know, it's very interesting, Mr. Speaker, the Premier didn't call in the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, he didn't call in the Privacy Commissioner, he didn't call in the Auditor General, he could have called in any number of people, but instead he turned the recording over to Canada's National Police Force, the RCMP. So I'll ask the Premier, what was on that recording specifically that caused him to call the RCMP?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wanted to tell the Honourable Member what initiated the contact with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, as they were mentioned in a letter was provided to this House. As part of that letter, there was a 40-second tape. We didn't think it would be appropriate, Mr. Speaker, to only give them the letter where they were mentioned. We gave them all the information. I know it may seem a bit confusing for the Leader of the Conservative Party. We have nothing to hide. We've turned over everything that we absolutely have. They will respond and do what they believe is right on behalf of the citizens of this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing that is confusing to all Nova Scotians is why the Premier and his Chief of Staff won't just be honest about what they know about that conversation that included the Chief of Staff and the member for Dartmouth East. They turned a recording over to the RCMP but won't say why. Well, here's a chance. What in that recording caused the Premier to turn it over to the police?
Just want to remind the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition indicated that the Premier will not be honest. That's unparliamentary, and I'll get you to apologize for that in a second. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for his question. I also want to thank you for the fact that no member's reputation should be impugned in this House by others with zero amount of fact. We provided to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police everything that was presented to us, the things that not only mentioned an officer from the law enforcement agency, but the attachment that came with it, Mr. Speaker. That's what Nova Scotians expect an open and honest government to do, and that is cooperate.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday a 43-second recording was released in which the Premier's Chief of Staff can be heard telling the member from Dartmouth East, and I quote, "I know you're taking a financial hit. I know that's painful. And if there's anything that we can do for your wife on that side, then, if there's anything, then let us know. Is there a personal service contract that we can do? Is there something we can do to help?" Mr. Speaker, by now I expect the Premier has had a chance to discuss this recording with Kirby McVicker. So my question to the Premier is, what explanation has his Chief of Staff given for offering a personal service contract to the wife of the member from Dartmouth North?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I said outside of this House yesterday, leading into that part of the tape, the member from Dartmouth East told my Chief of Staff that his wife would be losing her employment. My Chief of Staff made the suggestion that he made there in the tape that is there for everyone there. Let me be perfectly frank. No job was offered or provided at any time, and there was no personal service contract provided. It was part of a longer conversation that was a back and forth between, quite frankly, two people who work together. Mr. Speaker, when someone who said my wife is losing her job, what did she want him to say? What would she prefer him to say? Too bad, so sad.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier claimed yesterday he wasn't aware that Mr. McVicker offered the member of Dartmouth East's wife a job until the tape appeared. And last week, the Premier claimed he wasn't aware. Kirby McVicker told the member from Dartmouth East that having a criminal case tossed would help get him back into Cabinet. And 2 weeks prior to that, the Premier claimed he wasn't aware that Kirby McVicker knew a day in advance that the member from Dartmouth East would invoke privilege to avoid testifying under oath. So my question to the Premier is this: why is the Premier constantly being left in the dark about sensitive political matters by his Chief of Staff?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for her question. I want to remind all members of this House we're moving forward to provide sustainable, long-term collective agreements with our public sector, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, we announced 70 new entry jobs coming into the public service, Mr. Speaker. In addition, Mr. Speaker, over the next 5 years, Mr. Speaker. While that member might be sidetracked by the sideshows that take place around this place, Mr. Speaker, we're going to be focused on the best interests of Nova Scotia, delivering good government, Mr. Speaker, ensuring this province moves forward in a sustainable, affordable way, Mr. Speaker. They can continue to play in the circus. We're going to deliver good government.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has publicly stated that his Chief of Staff speaks for him. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, the only authority a Chief of Staff has comes from the Premier. Mr. Speaker, Kirby McVicker is on tape asking the member from Dartmouth East to come back and be a good soldier, and offering to provide his wife with a job using public funds. To the public, Mr. Speaker, these comments are a reflection of what the Premier wants, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier, given what was clearly stated on that tape, how can the Premier continue to employ Mr. McVicker as his Chief of Staff?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to continue to remind all Nova Scotians. We want to thank them for giving us the opportunity to provide good government back in October to end the 4 years of misery, Mr. Speaker, that was brought onto this province by this government. And Mr. Speaker, I also want to take the opportunity to respond. While that government was distracted by the sideshow, Mr. Speaker, our government is focused on moving this province forward. And each and every indicator, Mr. Speaker, each and every month, we're seeing positive results because our partners in this province believe in this government, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition, and I'll give you an opportunity to retract your earlier comment about the Premier being honest with Nova Scotians.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe I said or meant to say that I hope the Premier will be honest, but I certainly retract any implication that he has not been honest up to this point. I was trying to call on him to be honest in this situation, and so I retract what I said, Mr. Speaker, and would like to move on. Because I do want to make something very clear. The only sideshow, Mr. Speaker, is coming from the member of Dartmouth East and the Premier's office, not from the NDP, not from the PCs. Those are the two parties to the sideshow, Mr. Speaker. And you know what's very interesting? Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Premier said he was not happy about what he heard on that audio recording. Just now, in answers to questions from the NDP, he defended it and characterized it as a perfectly normal conversation between two people that work together. So I'd like to ask the Premier, which is it? Is he happy with what he heard in that recording or not?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. If he actually would read the entire statement that I said, what I said to the media yesterday, I was not happy with what I heard in that 40-second clip, but what I said will really clear this up. If the honourable member for Dartmouth East would release the entire tape, and my Chief of Staff would be happy to respond to the entire conversation, not 40 seconds at a time. That member might want to be led around this House by the member from Dartmouth East, but this government won't be.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I say again, the only two groups involved in this circus are the member for Dartmouth East and the Premier's office. Those are the only two. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier wants the member for Dartmouth East to say all he knows. That's great. Will the Premier hold his Chief of Staff to the same standard and bring him over here to answer questions on the same thing today?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times, I encourage the member from Dartmouth East to do what all members of this House has asked him to do, is release the entire tape, and my Chief of Staff will be happy to respond in its totality.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday wasn't the first time the hiring practices out of the Premier's office by the Chief of Staff have made the news. Back in February 2014, a Freedom of Information request showed that Kirby McVicker helped secure a personal services contract for the Premier's former Director of Communications, Glennie Langell, a job that previously had been subject to an open competition. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we found out that Mr. McVicker offered to arrange a personal service contract for the wife of the member from Dartmouth East. So my question to the Premier is this. How many people has Kirby McVicker hired on personal services contracts on behalf of the Premier's office and his government?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to, again, in this House, encourage the member from Dartmouth East to release the entire tape. My Chief of Staff will be more than happy to respond to the conversation in its totality, Mr. Speaker. And like most Chiefs of Staff, Mr. Speaker, they are part of the hiring process that takes place in any government, including the former government, Mr. Speaker, that the Chief of Staff would have been part of doing the hiring process.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
As a parent from the Premier's office, he continues to be in the dark about these matters. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have every right to be concerned about the standards that are being displayed by the Premier's office over the affairs who are fundamental in the affairs of this province. This is a Premier that's cut the film tax credit, placed thousands of screen jobs at risk, cut funding to non-profits, eliminated jobs in the public sector and community services offices. So I questioned the Premier, how does he justify offering a job to the wife of a Liberal MLA to help him deal with the loss of his cabinet salary when his government is cutting jobs across this province in the name of austerity?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to correct the honourable member. I did not offer a job to any member's spouse in this House, Mr. Speaker, but I do want to remind the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, we are moving forward in a sustainable way for this province. Very pleased, Mr. Speaker, the CFIB for 2 months in a row have indicated small businesses in this province at the highest confidence in the entire country, Mr. Speaker. Think about that. The highest confidence in the entire country. I know it's not all that long ago, but the honourable member should find out how confident small business were when she had an opportunity to sit on the side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also want to remind all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, last Friday when we had an opportunity to announce we would be hiring 70 new positions for the next 5 years inside the public service, filling vacancies with zero experience, providing young people an opportunity to stay in this province, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, 20,000 young people show us how important this province is by showing up every year to post-secondary education. And you know what they recognize, Mr. Speaker? They have a government, Mr. Speaker, that is looking for them to be part of the long-term sustainable future of this province.
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member for Dartmouth East was removed from Cabinet because the Premier felt he wasn't completely honest with him. The Premier had a Director of Communications who was set aside because the Premier felt he wasn't completely honest with him. Does the Premier still have confidence that his Chief of Staff has been completely honest with him in this matter?
The Honourable Premier.
Yes.
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Yes, we've heard that before, Mr. Speaker, and we know how it turned out. Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of questions about how many copies of conversations, audio conversations, may be floating around. Can the Premier confirm for this House today that he has checked that the government itself is not in possession of any of these conversations?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to reassure the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, that no member of this cabinet or our party or our government goes around secretly taping anybody, Mr. Speaker. And maybe I know, Mr. Speaker, for a Conservative that's hard to figure out, but quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, there is no conspiracy theory here. The reality of it is, whatever we have, we've provided to the appropriate people.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the people of Nova Scotia would be far more accepting of these answers if they actually answered the question, Mr. Speaker. If they actually had the people involved in these conversations here where they could tell for themselves, the people that know. Because once again, the only two groups involved are the member for Dartmouth East and the Premier's office itself, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier said he continues to have confidence in his Chief of Staff, even though he is part of a recording that is now under investigation by the RCMP. It's 24 hours later. I ask the Premier again, does he still have confidence in his Chief of Staff?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I don't know how the honourable member knows that is under investigation. I want to remind all members of this House, we provided it, Mr. Speaker, because their name was in it. And Mr. Speaker, I have all the confidence in Mr. McVicker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Premier is becoming known for being kept in the dark on things that go on in his government, but this is beyond the pale, Mr. Speaker. The RCMP have been very clear that they're investigating the material that he turned over to them, material that includes his Chief of Staff, Mr. Speaker. This is under investigation by the police. But that Chief of Staff, of course, is still in his job with the confidence of the Premier, and that's fine. That's how he's answered the question. But, Mr. Speaker, does the Premier really believe the Chief of Staff could stay in his job, basically in one of the most senior jobs in government, while the RCMP investigation is ongoing?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is stretching this a bit, Mr. Speaker. We provided the RCMP with the information that was provided to us. They are doing what any appropriate people would be to look at it, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure what the leader of the Conservative Party is looking for here, quite frankly. We've been forthright up front with Nova Scotians. We've continued, quite frankly, to provide good government. I know it's frustrating. I know it's frustrating for the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker, but at some point, Mr. Speaker, they have to stand up and say, boy, this government is finally leading this province in a positive, directive way.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Premier has made it clear he has confidence in his Chief of Staff, but, Mr. Speaker, can the public have confidence? That is the question, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's an unsettling pattern that has emerged from the Premier's office, a pattern where the Premier is kept in the dark on a regular basis. First, he didn't know about his former Director of Communications domestic assault arrest last year. Then he claimed he knew nothing about charges involving a former staffer and the member for Dartmouth East. He didn't know about the use of privilege in the court case, and now he claims he knew nothing about the conversation between his Chief of Staff and the member from Dartmouth East. Mr. Speaker, why is the Premier allowing his most senior staff to keep him in the dark about these important matters?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. It gives me an opportunity to continue to tell Nova Scotians positive direction. We're moving forward. I want to small businesses across this province, Mr. Speaker, have confidence in this government, Mr. Speaker, more confidence in any small business sector across the entire country, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell you we've continued, Mr. Speaker, to open up to make sure that young Nova Scotians get an opportunity to stay and work into this province, Mr. Speaker. I understand, Mr. Speaker, why the honourable members are frustrated, because, quite frankly, in 2 years, we're accomplishing twice as much as they were able to do in 4.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice. Mr. Speaker, the common thread among all these instances is the Premier's Chief of Staff. Yet the Premier continues to say that Mr. McVicker is doing a dandy job. He said that about the member from Dartmouth East as well the day before he changed his mind. Mr. Speaker, if you consider offering a personal services contract to Liberal insiders and constantly withholding information from your boss, a great job, then I guess those are standards. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, why are his standards so low for his senior advisors?
The Honourable
like his
Premier.
Chief of Staff?
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind her, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians responded not only to this Premier but to this entire group of well-meaning, well-educated, hard-working Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, because they saw a team of people who could lead this province, Mr. Speaker. Not only did they see, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, someone who could be the Premier, they saw any one of these colleagues who could be a cabinet minister. Unlike that member, who the former Premier had to manage every day of work she did as Minister of Finance and Minister of Health. I trust the members of this cabinet caucus, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be through you to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, what we have seen in past months and years is some cooperation amongst municipal units. We've seen it along the South Shore. The Pictos now talking positively. Unfortunately, where I come from, Mr. Speaker, in the constituency of Hants West, we have a couple of municipal units who are not quite on the positive side, but working towards some kind of partnership. And I wonder, and the Minister is very clear and aware of the current situation out there that's been going on now for some time, and not just on one or two issues, but on multiple issues, Mr. Speaker. And I wonder, has the Minister himself or his staff been directed to help encourage this process along now that it has started in West Hants?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. First and foremost, our government has been very involved in working with our municipal partners to achieve structural change in the province that will make our communities viable for the long run. The situation in West Hants and Windsor has been particularly concerning and unfortunate, I believe, for the citizens there and from the perspective of government. Our department has been very involved in trying to find a resolution for those two groups. We provided a mediator that wasn't able to bring those groups together, Mr. Speaker. It's very clear that the divisions in that community are long-standing and deep. However, we did work with West Hants in the direction that they wanted to move to have a new fire service, and I'm very happy to say that the continuation of coverage in that area has happened.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister's answer. Fire service is but one issue. There are multiple issues, and I know that the Minister is aware of that as well. This is a bit precedent-setting. What we do know is amalgamation will soon be filed for by a Citizens Coalition-led group, and maybe along with one of the two municipal units. Once that is done, there's a question around funding. Can the Minister speak to how that process might work if that application does move forward?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. As the Premier has said in this House and in public, change is coming to this province. We are either going to be defined by that change or we can define that change ourselves. We are working with all our municipal partners to achieve that structural change that we believe is necessary to secure viable communities moving Nova Scotia into the future, and we will work with all partners that share that goal.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much. My question through you is to the Minister of Health. More than halfway through the 5-year mental health strategy, many Nova Scotians have spoken out about their experience in the healthcare system. And it's clear the strategy is not working to address all issues. People are crying out for the government to listen and address their concerns, but the government is deciding to stick to the status quo. So my question to the Minister of Health, why won't the Minister admit changes are needed and provide an updated plan for the mental health services in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased today to speak to the honourable member and his question around mental health and the update of the strategy. The idea of a strategy is to obviously give it time to work, implement it province-wide. We still have a year and a half or more to go on the strategy. We also know that Dr. Corey with the Nova Scotia Provincial Health Authority is also involved in oversight province-wide, and that will help the strategy to be delivered across Nova Scotia.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt the toll broken mental health care system has on individuals. We've heard many stories here and in our constituency office. It is devastating for those people and those families. It's also true that the financial cost of a broken system will soon become unmanageable if we don't do something now. One study projects that mental illness will have a direct cost to the province of $1.4 billion by 2041 if we don't do something now. Now that he's aware of the human and financial cost of do nothing, will the minister accept that the status quo is not working and update the mental health strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What we do know in terms of the mental health strategy and the work being done across the province is, in fact, to do more in the early years. That was pointed out when Dr. Jan Davison did her report on the work of the IWK, Schools Plus and other supportive programs to children in our school, and will also be advancing further work in our schools. And we know that that is the best investment for the long term, and we'll continue to look at supporting our youth, especially those up to age 25.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, there are instances where police officers are recalled to respond to incidents where an individual may be having a mental health crisis. In those instances, it is important that officers have the training to handle these situations. And I think when I was asking this question, I was thinking about Robert Chikansky, rest his soul, and what happened to him in an airport in Vancouver. And I'm sure many people will remember that, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister of Justice inform the House what sort of training the province's police services receive to help individuals who are facing a mental health crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. It is a very good one to ask, and I'd like to assure everyone that the police do receive special training in mental health issues. A number of years ago here in our province, we had an incident as well where somebody was badly injured, and that was out of that came the Hyde report, and the commission was held to look into how we treat people with mental illness and people who are in crisis, and from that a lot of lessons were learned.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I know that best practices are involved in addressing mental health, and they're constantly evolving. This requires regular training. Can the Minister give us some understanding of what training is being offered now, and how will that training be continuously updated for the benefit of police officers and certainly for those who may be experiencing mental health crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. The whole issue of mental health in our society is big for every member of our government. We're concerned about that. On the policing side, I know it's very much in their minds because every day they're on the front line along with other first responders and seeing the issues that people are facing and the difficulty of mental illness in our province and certainly in our country. So they're very well aware of it. I know that the Chief of Police and and the, all of them really across the province work together as a group and have training that they share in, the RCMP as well. In terms of the specific details, if the member would like more, I can provide that for you. I'll get a more fulsome answer. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister in charge of the Film Incentive Fund. I'd like to table a chart from IATSE Local 849 that compares the amount of work its members had last fall under the old Nova Scotia Film and Television Tax Credit and this fall with the new film incentive and the number of films and TV series being made. The drop is dramatic. When questioned about the job loss, the minister stated that the downturn was due to the sudden closure of AIG Films, and I'll table that as well. But the IATSE chart focuses on TV, film, and TV series, not commercials. How does the minister explain the sudden drop in films and TV series being made in Nova Scotia this fall?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I don't know what comments I've made that the member is referring to. I don't recall having any comments about AIG, but if I stand to be corrected, I'd value that information. Mr. Speaker, one thing we've heard clearly from the industry over the past number of months is we both want the same thing. And our government has listened to the concerns of Screen Nova Scotia. We've taken the discussions we've had. We agree that there's a need to change the discussion on the future opportunities of the industry in Nova Scotia. And we've taken steps, Mr. Speaker, to restore the confidence of those domestically and internationally on the opportunities of the film industry in Nova Scotia. We announced last Friday a significant investment in the film industry. They were receptive to that. They've publicly endorsed that, and they publicly endorsed the Film Television Production Incentive Fund.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
On November 10th, international film consultant Jan Miller said that Nova Scotia went from having one of the best film tax credits in the country to one of the worst incentives to film, and I will table that document. We heard that one of the major barriers to making the new film incentive fund work better is the cap placed on the fund of $10 million. My question then is, when will the minister lift the cap to ensure that the current film incentive fund doesn't lead to more uncertainty?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. As I indicated earlier, we've engaged the film industry. I've met with producers, with technicians, with crew, multiple components of the industry on multiple sets over the past number of months. And I want to table a piece of correspondence from the media, Mr. Speaker, from July of 2015, where the producer of The Healer himself, a prominent international producer, stated, "My feeling is the new incentive scheme is very workable and can go a long way towards helping keep film and television shows coming back to Nova Scotia." Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Business as well. As he's well aware, being an MLA from Southwest Nova Scotia, the challenges we're having with Eastlink Internet service, broadband Internet service, and access to what I would qualify almost a right these days, be able to access, for students to be able to access information, that is Internet service, broadband Internet service. I've asked many questions to a number of ministers here in the House of Assembly on what the government's doing about it, if there's any way that they can entice companies to provide a service that is acceptable to today's standards. So I'm just wondering, maybe the minister can provide an update on what he's doing when it comes to Internet service to rural areas.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from my colleague. We recognize and acknowledge the importance of high-speed Internet broadband through rural Nova Scotia for the reasons my colleague has mentioned, both for education, healthcare, for small business, a number of reasonable options that anyone would pursue. But to the point, we've done a number of community consultations. We've reached out to the industry extensively. We've just recently concluded a statement of work where we're looking for an industry expert, Mr. Speaker, to provide guidance to government on the opportunities that are there, as well as the challenges that we face. So we continue along that line, and we're getting tremendous feedback from the industry in that initiative.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
I thank you very much for that answer, Minister. But I also want to ask the Minister, in more maybe state, you know, Eastlink Internet Service in Southwest Nova Scotia, more specifically in Argyll-Barrington, has built out their wired system. They're hoping that once that wired system and people are connected to it, that the wireless system actually gets a little better. But there's really no guarantees in that. And we also, I think we have a company that has a wireless system that honestly doesn't really want it, doesn't really know what to do with it. So I'm hoping that the minister, steps in as best he can, that this government steps in to make sure that industry truly helps those small rural communities who deserve to have good internet service.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's an appropriate recognition of a small company in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. As I engaged the industry, a service provider indicated to me that they were providing quality high-speed internet in Digby Neck, Long Island, and I quite honestly, Mr. Speaker, thought that if they can provide high-speed quality internet in Long Island, one of the most geographically distant communities in our province, that we should be able to provide that in any community. We've asked the industry for their input. They've provided that feedback. We continue to work with small providers. Particularly, Mr. Speaker, an initiative by Mainland Communication now as we speak in Lunenburg County, where they recognize the density of a community, and they're working with that community group to meet their needs.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister responsible for the Human Rights Act. We hear of people waiting extraordinary amounts of time to make their case before the Human Rights Commission. And the media has also reported on a big backlog there that takes years in some cases. And I have a constituent that said 7 years they've been working on one of these things. So that's obviously a long time to make your day in court, as it would be. So my question is, what does the minister say to these people that are waiting such extraordinary amounts of time to make their appearance before the Human Rights Commission?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question because the honourable member has raised an issue that's important to all Nova Scotians. Many people turn to the Human Rights Commission when they have a serious problem, a question they need addressed, and it is not right to have it take so long. So it's certainly a concern to me as minister and to our government that it takes a long time. Really, there's been backlogs, I would say, in that. I can say that I visited the Human Rights Commission office. They are certainly being restructured and organized. They have a very good working commission board, so we've made sure the appointments are in place for that. And I know that it is a concern and an issue for us to advance those case times.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Minister. We do sometimes see cases where Crown corporations get a ruling and then certainly appear to drag things out with appeals and other practices. And I hear mumblings amongst people that they feel that the Crown corporations are more likely to do that because they're taxpayer funded. They're using taxpayer money as opposed to their own money. So my question today is for the minister is who actually holds the Crown corporations responsible for being accountable and prudent with taxpayer money and making sure that they're doing what's morally and financially right?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you very much again, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that. That was a little bit of a little veiled in terms of the question that was asked. I'm not sure exactly what cases that the member is referring to, so I'd be happy to speak to you further at the end of our House today and find out more about that. But I can say that every organization, whether they're a Crown corporation, a private organization, government, or otherwise, we all are held to the same standard to cooperate with the Human Rights Commission or the Ombudsman's Office or any of the independent offices that we have in this province to ensure that people have an opportunity to be heard and that justice is served.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, in February of 2014, the Rural Development Minister, who is now the Minister of Energy, said that Internet provider Eastlink had until the end of the year to offer rural broadband service to isolated pockets of the province, and I will table that. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's almost the end of 2015, and residents of southwestern Nova Scotia are still without reliable Internet service. So my question to the Minister of Business is, why are hundreds of residents in southwestern Nova Scotia still without reliable Internet service?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. There's a very simple answer to the question that my colleague has advanced. When the broadband contract initiated in 2007, a commitment was made to meet 100% hookup by 2009. That was extended to 2010. The objective was never achieved, and it was the NDP government, Mr. Speaker, who paid out the invoices on the contract that expired on December the 31st, 2014, indicating to the service provider, Mr. Speaker, that all of the commitments have been met for that contract. That government, that member, a minister at the time, failed to provide Nova Scotians a service that they committed to.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I suggest that the minister check his facts, because that contract was still in existence under the Liberal government, and also the Liberal government could have taken a stance towards Eastlink to make sure that they fulfilled their commitment, and they have done nothing with Eastlink. And people in Nova Scotia are tired of waiting. So I'll ask the minister, what is the date by which residents without reliable Internet can expect to be provided with this service under the Liberal government who says that they can solve everything?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to acknowledge the large number of Nova Scotians, particularly in southwest Nova Scotia, that do not have high-speed Internet service. And we're working with them and industry providers, service providers, to try and find solutions. But, Mr. Speaker, that member, as a cabinet minister, had the opportunity in government for 4 years to address this problem, and all they did, Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, they paid out the contract to the service provider, suggesting that the service was completed. There's no punitive action that the government could have taken under the contract to change that, Mr. Speaker. That government failed Nova Scotians, they paid the bill out, and the service wasn't provided.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Immigration. Mr. Speaker, as we've heard a lot about, especially in the last week, a lot of talk about refugees coming to Canada and certainly to this part of the world in Nova Scotia. And I know that the Minister made an announcement in previous days regarding 211, and if you're interested in helping and so on, to contact that number, but has there been further processes put in place whereby individuals that are quite interested in being part of this program can apply to or contact?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for that very important question today. It's one that affects all Nova Scotians and all Canadians, especially today being the National Child Day. We all need to be caring and compassionate, especially when it comes to children. We believe probably 50% of the refugees that will come will be children as well. So we did make an announcement a couple of days ago on the 211, and I'm very pleased to say that they issued a press release yesterday. As of yesterday at noon, they had over 600 callers that have called to offer volunteer services as well as cash donations. They've also released an email address where people can also send emails if they don't wish to make the phone call. Again, we remind everybody to please keep doing that. Anybody that wants to help. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for some clarity in the answer, but I guess I was looking just a wee bit deeper than that. There are people that are actually quite interested in housing, of course, some of these refugees that are coming, just really wanting to know, is there a different process other than 211 by way of an application or contacting your office directly, or how will that work, or perhaps you're still working on that program? I don't know. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very happy to elaborate a bit further to my colleague and everyone in the legislature. Certainly, groups of 5 or organizations can privately sponsor refugees. The best way to do that is to do it through a sponsorship agreement holder. Currently, there's 5 in the province, the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Baptist Church, the United Church, and of course, Immigrant Settlement Association of Nova Scotia. So there's been many meetings that have been held across the province with various communities. We know there's at least 60 private groups currently that are mobilizing and are agreeing to sponsor refugees, and we look forward to receiving many more. So any further questions, please contact us. You can also look at our website, nsimmigration/refugee, and we have all the information on the website as well. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. Most large high schools in the province have a full-time maintenance employee. CEC in Truro and John U. Gillis in Antigonish are examples of this. This employee is invaluable, arriving early to remove snow and ice outside, repairing numerous items for the school, from replacing light bulbs, checking faulty technology, washrooms, checking on furnaces and ventilation systems are some examples of what they do. Some schools do not have this type of employee. Perhaps the school board's attempt to improve their bottom line has eliminated this position in some schools. My question to the Minister, should all schools in our province, especially our large schools, have the convenience of having a full-time employee responsible for maintenance that often requires immediate attention?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. I think it's important to state here publicly that one of the most valued staff members we can have in any school is a custodian who makes sure that the school is safe and clean. The safety and security of our students is of utmost importance, and the maintenance custodian staff member who's there has a huge responsibility. I commend them for the work they do every day in our schools. I would remind the member that, as he, I believe, would know, as the member would know, the responsibility for staffing our schools, the allocation that goes to those schools, whether they're large or small, is a responsibility of the school board.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, approximately 3 years ago, North Nova Education Centre and Northumberland Regional High School had this position eliminated. I believe their savings by doing this will be overshadowed by what it will eventually cost the school board. If you talk to administrators, they'll tell you the school wouldn't function without them. Eventually, in-house maintenance begins to deteriorate. Schools have to wait for personnel to arrive to fix a problem. In fact, they may pass 4 burned-out light bulbs to fix one on their work order. They usually follow their work order and leave. My question to the Minister, should it be a standard policy, if a school is a certain size, that they have a full-time maintenance person on duty?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member. The decision about the allocation of staff to schools to provide the services that we have all identified here as being absolutely critical is a decision that's made by the board, and as with respect to a policy, it would be a board policy about how they wish to allocate those services to the schools under their jurisdiction.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For 2 years, the Minister of Community Services has frozen income assistance rates for Nova Scotia's most vulnerable. We know that the department is undergoing a massive transformation which will affect the employment support and income assistance program. When the minister was asked by CBC whether any increases can be expected, while the minister finishes her review of the program, which is scheduled to be completed by 2018, she stated, in terms of money at this point in time, nothing, and I'd like to table that. Mr. Speaker, would the minister outline when income assistance recipients can expect their assistance to catch up with the cost of living?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud of the work that the department is doing in transformation. We've known for a couple of decades that there's been piecemeal, incremental changes that have happened that have not kept up to the pace of the unique and comprehensive needs of the people who use our services. I'm excited about Phase 2. We've finished Phase 1 in July. I'm excited about Phase 2, which is coming up over the next 18 months, where we can see some meaningful, significant change that will better meet the needs of people who use our services in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, a freeze in income assistance is a cut. The cost of living over the past 2 years has increased by 3% and will continue to rise during the transformation. This means that Nova Scotia's most vulnerable will be forced to get by with less and less. In a recent, Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain how women and their children are supposed to make do while the income assistance transformation takes place?
Good.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. I find it really quite astounding that the member from the previous government, of which he was not a part of, actually is concerned about people on income assistance.
Time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers has expired. The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand on a point of order because I believe during the question period, in response to a question, I heard the Premier swear, Mr. Speaker, and he was not corrected by you. Mr. Speaker, I would ask you to listen to the tapes of the recorded question period to determine whether or not that in fact occurred, and use your judgment accordingly, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
I'll take that under advisement and bring that back to the House. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Hold it. Let it go. Let it go.
Order, please. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr.